Under the hot sun, a polished mahogany casket gleamed like a final trophy. Wealthy mourners in black gathered, whispering their farewells to a man they claimed was gone. But in the shadows, standing barefoot in torn clothes, was someone no one wanted there. A homeless man, ignored, dismissed, and despised by the very people in front of him. His eyes, however, told a different story. He had seen the truth. As the priest lifted his hand to close the service, the homeless man suddenly shouted, his voice cracking through the silence. "Stop! He's not dead!" The crowd erupted in disbelief and anger. Who would trust a man society had already thrown away? Yet, what he knew could either save a life or bury the truth forever. So, what really happened that day? And why did no one want to believe him? His name was Ethan Walker. Once he had been just like anyone else in the crowd. Clean clothes, a job, a small apartment, a sense of belonging. But life has a cruel way of stripping a man bare, piece by piece, until the world no longer sees him as human. Ethan had lost his job after being wrongfully accused of theft at a construction site. Nobody cared to listen to his side. Not his boss, not the police, and certainly not the community. A black man with no money, no influence, and no voice. What chance did he have? That was years ago. Since then, Ethan had been sleeping under bridges, eating scraps, and learning the brutal code of survival on the streets. Every day, he carried the heavy weight of being invisible. Or worse, not invisible but hated. People crossed the street when they saw him. Store owners barked at him to leave, even when he was just standing outside to rest. Yet, what no one knew was that Ethan was sharper, more observant, and far more decent than most of the men wearing suits in that crowd. But why was he here, at this funeral? It all began 2 weeks earlier. Ethan had been scrounging near the city docks when he noticed something strange. A private ambulance parked in the dead of night with men hurriedly loading something inside. He wasn't supposed to see, but through the crack of the back door, Ethan caught a glimpse of the body they carried. The face wasn't pale like the dead. The chest rose, faint but steady. The man wasn't gone. Ethan's instincts screamed it. He'd seen enough lifeless bodies on the streets to know the difference between death and life. But who was the man? And why were they treating him like cargo to be hidden? The next morning, word spread. A powerful real estate mogul, Richard Holloway, had died suddenly. The city's elite mourned loudly in the papers, praising his success and legacy. Ethan read those headlines and shivered. He remembered that chest rising. He remembered that face. Richard Holloway wasn't dead. Not yet. Still, what could a homeless man do? If he spoke up, people would laugh in his face. If he tried to stop the funeral, they'd have him arrested before he finished a sentence, unless he found proof. For the next 2 weeks, Ethan shadowed the Holloway estate. Lurking in the corners, no one bothered to look. He dug through discarded papers, overheard half-whispered conversations from the servants, and pieced together a puzzle that chilled him to his core. There were financial deals in the balance, shady contracts, and heirs waiting impatiently for inheritance. Richard Holloway had enemies, and maybe even family who wanted him gone. Ethan didn't know the full truth yet, but he knew one thing for certain. If he didn't act, a man would be buried alive. And that knowledge gnawed at him every hour. The day of the funeral arrived. Ethan stood outside the gates, barefoot, dirty, and ignored. People sneered at him, muttered insults, even shoved him aside. To them, he was nothing but a parasite trying to sneak in for free food or attention. Their hatred pressed against him like waves, but he held his ground, because he knew something they didn't. When the casket was brought out, glistening under the sun, Ethan's pulse quickened. His eyes locked on the polished wood, as though his gaze alone could see through it. He could almost hear Richard Holloway's faint breaths inside. Every step closer to the grave felt like another nail in the man's coffin. Not metaphorical, but real. Ethan clenched his fists. This was his moment, and in that moment he had to decide. Stay silent and watch a man die, or speak up and risk losing the little dignity he had left. The world saw a homeless outcast, but only Ethan knew the truth, and the truth was about to tear this funeral apart. The air around the Holloway estate funeral was suffocating with wealth and indifference. Guests in tailored suits and silk dresses whispered to each other, more interested in appearances than grief. To them, the funeral wasn't mourning, it was networking. Ethan stood outside the iron gates, his stomach tight, his fists clenched, his mind racing. He had seen Richard Holloway breathe. He knew this man was alive. Yet every second brought the casket closer to the earth. If he waited too long, there'd be no undoing what was about to happen. But how could a man who lived on scraps make the powerful listen? When the priest began his solemn words, Ethan stepped forward. His voice cracked but carried across the crowd. "He's not dead." Heads turned instantly. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some guests gasped, others scowled. The guards moved in swiftly, ready to drag him out. "You're disturbing the service," one guard hissed, shoving him back. But Ethan stood his ground. "Listen to me, Richard Holloway is alive in that coffin. You bury him, and you'll be burying a man who's still breathing." The crowd erupted. Some laughed at the absurdity. Others whispered in disgust, and one pair of eyes, sharp, cold, watched Ethan more closely than the rest. It was Daniel Holloway, Richard's ambitious nephew. He was next in line to inherit the empire. His jaw tightened as he studied the ragged figure daring to speak against their ceremony. Daniel signaled to the guards, but not before giving Ethan a look that sent a chill down his spine. Why wasn't Daniel surprised? Why didn't he deny the accusation right away? Instead, Daniel smirked faintly, as if Ethan had just revealed too much. Dragged out of the ceremony, Ethan hit the gravel hard. His skin burned, his throat raw, but his resolve only grew stronger. The crowd returned to its polite mourning, dismissing him as just another lunatic. But Ethan wasn't finished. He scrambled back up and pressed himself against the wrought iron fence, watching as the casket edged closer to the grave. Every nail hammered shut was another chance lost. He shouted again, his voice hoarse but desperate. "Check his pulse. For God's sake, somebody check his pulse." The priest hesitated for a split second. Some guests glanced uneasily at the coffin. Doubt flickered, but Daniel quickly stepped forward, placing a hand on the priest's shoulder, whispering something. Whatever he said, it made the priest continue without pause. The coffin was being lowered. Ethan's heart raced. He was losing this battle, unless he found a way back inside. That night, long after the crowd dispersed, Ethan lingered in the shadows near the estate. His body ached, but his spirit burned. He had to uncover proof before morning, or Richard Holloway would suffocate beneath the earth. Slipping through the trees, Ethan found his way to the servants' quarters. Workers often discarded documents and food scraps in bins outside. He dug through them until his fingers brushed against a torn envelope. Inside was a note, written in rushed handwriting. Payment confirmed. Procedure completed. Ensure burial proceeds as scheduled. Do not delay. Ethan's stomach twisted. This wasn't just neglect. This was a plot. Someone had orchestrated Richard's premature burial, and Ethan was the only one who could stop it. The next day, Ethan returned to the cemetery. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't slept, but he had purpose. He waited until the Holloway family arrived to oversee the final burial rites. Daniel was there, smug as ever, surrounded by lawyers and family members already calculating the inheritance. Ethan broke through the line of mourners, holding the note high above his head. "You think I'm crazy? Then explain this." Gasps echoed. The paper was seized instantly, passed among trembling hands. Some guests frowned, recognizing Richard's business associates mentioned in the letter. Doubt spread faster now, but Daniel was quick. He sneered, calling it forgery, insisting Ethan was just a desperate vagrant seeking attention. The guards closed in again, dragging Ethan across the dirt. Yet, as he was hauled away, Ethan shouted the words that would haunt the crowd. "You'll remember my face when the truth comes out, and when you hear him screaming from that coffin." That night Ethan found no shelter. Rain pounded the streets as he huddled beneath a bridge. But his mind replayed every detail. The ambulance, the letter, Daniel's smirk. There was still time. Burials sometimes took days for final ceremonies. He had to act again, but how? His answer came in the form of an unlikely ally. An older maid from the Holloway estate found him near the cemetery wall. Her wrinkled hands trembled as she passed him a folded piece of paper. "I saw the rise in his chest, too," she whispered. "You're not mad, but if you fight them, they'll destroy you." Inside the paper was a sketch of the burial schedule. Times, locations, access points. Hope flickered again. On the final morning, Ethan disguised himself in discarded work clothes and slipped into the cemetery before dawn. The air was cold, heavy with mist. The coffin sat above the open grave, waiting for its final descent. His heart pounded as he crouched behind a mausoleum. He had one chance to open it before they sealed Richard Holloway beneath forever. Footsteps crunched on gravel. Guards, lawyers, Daniel Holloway himself. The burial was minutes away. Ethan's muscles tensed, ready to spring. He would not let them finish this. But could one broken man fight the entire machine of wealth, power, and corruption? The answer would shake the entire city. The morning mist clung to the cemetery like a heavy veil, dampening the air, muffling sound, and making every step Ethan took feel heavier than the last. He crouched low, hidden behind a crumbling mausoleum, watching as the Holloway family gathered once again. The polished mahogany casket gleamed in the pale light. The final ceremony about to begin. Daniel Holloway stood tall among the mourners, his expensive black suit immaculate, his lips curved in the faintest smirk. He looked less like a grieving nephew and more like a king surveying conquered land. Lawyers clustered nearby, holding briefcases, contracts, and pens, ready to seal not just a grave, but the transfer of power. Ethan's chest tightened. He had no allies here. Only the faint crinkle of paper in his pocket, the maid's sketch of the burial schedule, reminded him that he wasn't completely alone. And beyond that coffin lay a man who might still be breathing, praying someone would fight for him. The priest lifted his hand, beginning the final prayer. Shovels leaned ready against the earth. Time was over. Ethan surged forward from the shadows. His heart hammered, his legs felt like lead, but adrenaline carried him. "Stop!" he screamed, his voice raw, cracking through the silence like thunder. "Don't bury him! He's alive!" Gasps cut the air. Heads whipped toward him. Guards lunged, but Ethan shoved past, clawing toward the casket. He was tackled, slammed into the wet grass, but he kept shouting, "Check his pulse! Open the coffin! He's not gone!" The crowd erupted in chaos. Some jeered. Others looked shaken. But Daniel's face hardened, panic flickering beneath his polished exterior. "Get him out!" Daniel barked, his voice sharper, more desperate this time. But Ethan thrashed like a man possessed. "You'll regret this," he cried. "If you lower that coffin, you'll be murderers." The priest froze mid-verse. His hands trembled. The words wouldn't come. His gaze darted toward the casket as whispers spread like wildfire through the crowd. Could it be true? Could this ragged stranger really be right? One of the guards hesitated, his grip on Ethan faltering. The seed of doubt had been planted. Ethan saw his chance. With a burst of strength, he shoved free and lunged for the coffin. His fingers scraped the polished wood, and with a cry that was half sob, half battle, he clung to it. "Help me open it," he screamed. "If I'm wrong, I'll leave forever. But if I'm right, you'll thank me for the rest of your lives." The crowd trembled with uncertainty. Eyes darted between Daniel, who barked orders with rising fury, and Ethan, who trembled with desperate conviction. Then it happened. A faint sound, soft, muffled, but undeniable. A thump. From inside the coffin, the world seemed to stop. Mourners gasped, some shrieking, others stepping back as though the coffin itself had cursed them. The priest dropped his book, his face pale as bone. Ethan's tears blurred his vision, but his voice rose with new strength. "He's alive. Open it now." Guards faltered, looking at Daniel for instruction. But Daniel's face had drained of color. He shouted, "Don't listen. It's a trick." Yet his voice cracked, betraying his fear. Another thump, louder this time, followed by a ragged, desperate groan. The cemetery erupted in chaos. Guests screamed. Some fainted. Others rushed forward. Ethan pounded on the wood, his own fists raw. "Hold on, Richard. I won't let them kill you." At last, the guards wavered. One dropped to his knees, fumbling with the coffin's latch. Another joined him, ignoring Daniel's furious protests. The lid creaked open. Silence fell, so heavy it pressed against every chest. Inside, Richard Holloway's pale face twitched. His chest heaved faintly. His lips parted with a gasp, sucking in air like a drowning man breaking the surface. He was alive. Screams turned into cries of shock and awe. Some mourners dropped to their knees, others backed away in horror at what they had almost done. Ethan sobbed, his body collapsing against the earth, relief flooding him. His ragged voice whispered, I told you he was still breathing." Richard's eyes fluttered, confused, but alive. Daniel's mask finally shattered. He roared, lunging at Ethan, fury twisting his features. "You ruined everything." He spat, his voice feral. But before he could strike, 2 guards restrained him. Not Ethan. The crowd had seen too much. The letter, the hesitation, the smirk. And now this, proof of his corruption. Whispers turned to accusations. He wanted Richard dead. This was planned. He tried to bury him alive, Daniel thrashed, his voice cracking with desperation. No, he was gone. He was gone. But no one believed him anymore. Richard Holloway, trembling but alive, raised a frail hand, pointing straight at Ethan. His lips quivered, and with the strength of a man returned from death, he whispered one word: hero. The crowd erupted, not with jeers this time, but with awe. Ethan, the man they had laughed at, spat on and cast aside, had done what no wealth, no power, no privilege could achieve. He had saved a life and exposed a crime that would haunt the Holloway name forever. But for Ethan, the story wasn't over yet. The cemetery that had been filled with whispers and contempt now stood in stunned silence. The once proud guests, men and women who had scoffed at Ethan's very presence, were forced to confront the undeniable. A man they nearly buried alive was gasping for air before their eyes, saved not by wealth, not by family, but by the ragged voice of someone they never thought worthy of listening to. Richard Holloway, weak but alive, clung to the arms of the guards as he was lifted out of the coffin. His lips trembled, his gaze sweeping the faces of his guests, pausing on Daniel, whose mask had shattered into fury and terror. Then Richard's gaze found Ethan. The smallest nod passed between them. Gratitude, recognition. Ethan, for the first time in years, felt seen. But not everyone shared that moment. Daniel was dragged away, screaming accusations, cursing Ethan's name. His inheritance, his schemes, his entire world had crumbled in front of him. Guests whispered of police investigations, of fraud, of attempted murder. It was only a matter of time before his crimes were dragged into the light. For Ethan, though, the battle was far from over. Even after saving a man's life, he felt the weight of every sneer, every whisper, every assumption that still clung to him like a shadow. As Richard was rushed to medical care, the crowd parted for the billionaire's stretcher. But not for Ethan. He stood alone, dripping wet, ragged, exhausted, and yet victorious. Days later, the news spread everywhere. Headlines blazed. Homeless man exposes murder plot at millionaire's funeral. Hero from the streets saves Richard Holloway. From outcast to savior. Some called Ethan a hero. Others, especially those who once mocked him, quietly changed their tone, pretending they had always believed him. The truth was undeniable now, but Ethan didn't crave the spotlight. What he wanted was dignity, a chance to live without being treated as invisible. And in a twist no one expected, Richard Holloway gave him that chance. Weeks after the incident, when Richard had recovered enough to speak publicly, he held a press conference. Cameras flashed, microphones swarmed, but his voice was steady. He recounted everything. The scheme, the betrayal, the moment a man everyone dismissed saved his life. Then, With the world watching, Richard pointed to Ethan, standing quietly at the back of the room. "This man," Richard declared, "is the reason I am alive. You may have called him a vagrant, a beggar, a nobody, but he is worth more than all the wealth in this room combined. Because when power failed me, when family betrayed me, it was his humanity that saved me." The room erupted with applause. For Ethan, it was overwhelming. Tears burned his eyes, but he held them back, standing tall. For once, he wasn't invisible. But beyond the applause and headlines, there was something deeper, something that mattered more than recognition. Communities began whispering about change, about listening to voices long ignored, about how prejudice blinded them from seeing the truth until it nearly cost a man his life. Some dismissed it as a fleeting moment. Others took it to heart. For Ethan, the journey was not about becoming a hero. It was about survival, dignity, and being heard. Saving Richard Holloway gave him a platform, yes, but more than that. It proved that even those on the margins of society hold truths that cannot be silenced. And perhaps, just perhaps, it reminded people that humanity is not measured by wealth, but by compassion. As Ethan walked out of the press hall that day, reporters shouting his name, flashes blinding his eyes, he paused. For the first time in years, he had hope. I hope that tomorrow he won't just be a man the world ignores. Hope that somewhere, someone watching his story might see the humanity in others they had once dismissed. And with that, he turned and walked into the light of a new day. Because sometimes, the most unthinkable part of a story isn't the crime, it's the redemption. So, what do you think? If you had been there, would you have listened to Ethan's voice, or dismissed him like the rest? Tell me in the comments. Watch our previous video for another powerful story. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps these stories reach the world.